cyber policy responses by Japan and Australia to the Russia-Ukraine war. I'm Glenn Withers. I'm the founding director of the Social Cyber Institute, which is the not-for-profit public analysis arm of the Social Cyber Group. I'm also an emeritus professor in the ANU's Crawford School of Public Policy in Canberra, Australia. May I begin by extending a very warm welcome to all our participants today, including many from around the globe. Now, the real content of what we're doing, let me briefly introduce the speakers, though there's much more in the detail in the invitations we sent you, and also, of course, in their other institutional and web links. First amongst the speakers will be Mahoko Matsubara, drawing particularly on her book, Ukraine Cyber War, which was published in Japanese in August 2023. Miho is the chief cyber strategist with NTT in Tokyo. And just to remind you, NTT is one of the top 110 in the global Fortune 500. So Miho has some substantial responsibilities and takes, therefore, her cyber responsibilities very seriously. And Miho will be followed by Greg Austin. Greg's the co-author of the very recent IISS report, International Institute of Strategic Studies report, Impact of the Russia-Ukraine War on National Cyber Planning, a survey of 10 countries. And Greg's also an adjunct professor at the Australia-China Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney, and a co-founder of Social Cyber Institute. Our structure for what we'll be doing today, we'll have Japan's responses to Russia-Ukraine from Miho for 15 to 20 minutes, and there's a screen of PowerPoint there for accompanying that. Then we'll have Greg doing the same for Australia's responses to the Russia-Ukraine war, and Greg has a PowerPoint as well. And then we're actually asking each of our presenters to reflect on the others' presentations for up to 5 minutes each, and then opening up to Q&A. And I'd ask you, if you wouldn't mind, to submit your questions under Q&A through the Q&A function. We're not going to have the raised hand function. That produces a little too difficult with the numbers we're dealing with to coordinate and manage. But if you would please just write your Q&A questions, and I'll seek to intermediate those to our speakers and any others that may need responses. And if you want any social communication, then you can use the chat function. But we, the speakers, will not be reading the chat function. We'll be just looking at Q&A. So please put your questions and comments into Q&A for a response to the presentations. So let me hand over, if I could, to our first speaker, Miho. So over to you, Miho.
Sure. Thank you so much. So let me pull up my PowerPoint slide. Hold on. Okay, great. So thank you so much for having me today, and I really appreciate your time to spend with us to talk about lessons to learn from the ongoing war in Ukraine from cybersecurity perspectives, especially from Japanese and Australian perspectives. So I'd like to share how the Japanese have been observing the cyber war in Ukraine, and also how to apply to our better security and cybersecurity posture in Japan. So I think that the ongoing war in Ukraine is really close to the Japanese heart. Not only this has created such an atrocity, but also because it reminded us of the potential war in the Taiwan Strait. So I'd like to talk about not only Ukraine, but also about Taiwan and Japan, and also how to move forward and the next steps. So before the February 2022 invasion by the Russians, I think the Japanese had like a similar expectations. Now, well, we are not so sure if the invasion will occur or not. But if it happens, it will certainly entail disruptive cyber sabotage by the Russians, just like what happened in 2014, the annexation of Crimea, but also the takedown of power grid in 2015, 2016 due to the Russian cyber attacks, and also the Russia's wiper malware attacks in June 2017. Because the Russians wiper malware attacks in 2017 was not able to contain just in the border of Ukraine. It actually expanded to 65 countries in total, and it posted a total damage of 10 billion US dollars at that time. So Japanese are concerned, or maybe this war will lead into cascading effects by cyber disruptions to the rest of the world, including Japan. But obviously, it didn't happen. Why? And I think that the Japanese have been taking a closer look at the really wonderful cyber defenses by the Ukrainian friends have been taken after, even before the aggression happened in February 2022. So according to the Financial Times article, in addition to US Cyber Command press releases, the US government had helped the Ukrainians to enhance their cyber posture before the invasion. So for instance, according to the Financial Times, the US Army and the US companies sent cybersecurity experts to Ukraine in October to November 2021. It means that a few months before the aggression happened, and they did threat hunting, meaning they tried to find the foothold created by the Russian hackers within the networks of Ukrainian critical infrastructure companies. And in fact, they were able to find wiper malware in the networks of the Ukrainian railway. And I'm sure that everybody who is watching this webinar now is still clearly remembers what we observed on the TV screens or your computer screens or newspapers and what happened after the aggressions. Many Ukrainian people actually took the Ukrainian railway to evacuate from their own countries to the neighboring countries. And also the Ukrainian railway played a key role, has been playing a key role to bring humanitarian and military aid from other countries through Poland to Ukraine. But what if Ukrainians and Americans didn't do these threat hunting operations in advance? Maybe they were not able to find and delete the wiper beforehand, so maybe the Russians were able to activate it on the day of aggression. But it didn't happen. Why? Because the pre-war cyber best practices actually worked. But not only that, the Ukrainian friends did their own cybersecurity best practices. So the Ukrainians had faced cyber attacks, both cyber espionage and cyber disruptions from the Russians over and over again. And the Ukraine had accumulated their expertise on how to deal with Russian cyber attacks, and they actually created a database on cyber attacks by each Russian hacker group. But when they started to see the increase in Russian cyber attacks in January 2022, 1 month before the aggression, the Ukrainian government reportedly decided to create a red teams to actually attack their own IT system to make sure that there is no gap of cyber defenses. So in this way, till the last moment of aggression, physical aggressions, the Ukrainians have been able to increase their cyber defenses to prepare for cyber attacks in accordance with the aggression. So I've already covered now why the Ukrainians have been able to show the success of the cyber defenses to the rest of the world over the last 2 years. And I think they are the two significant factors we should notice from cyber defense perspectives. So first one is that Ukraine took actually 8 years to enhance their cyber defenses since 2014, namely the annexation of Crimea. So they learned the lessons from the past cyber attacks and also accumulated their knowledge and created a database to have a better incident response capabilities. And second, they were able to gain better and deeper and bigger international collaboration with different governments, including Australia, NATO, United States, and United Kingdom, and Estonia, and Netherlands, and others. But also they were able to create a good cybersecurity collaboration mechanism with big tech companies such as Microsoft, Amazon, Google, CrowdStrike, and others. Because cyber domain is such a unique domain consisting of artificial systems, not natural systems like land or ocean, cyber domain has to rely on the input from companies. So that is why the success of Ukraine's cyber defenses attributes a lot to the help from major tech companies. But when you think about cybersecurity, you also have to think about the physical security to support cybersecurity. Why? Again, because the cyber domain consists of artificial systems and services and technologies provided by companies. So if you cannot provide a good physical security of those systems or infrastructure, you cannot maintain a good cybersecurity. And I think that at least a big, according to news reports, Ukrainian companies have been able to provide good resilience from physical security and cybersecurity of their infrastructure. So I'd like to give you one example from Kyivstar, one of the largest telecommunication service provider in Ukraine. So Kyivstar noticed that the Russian militaries came near the border between Ukraine and Russia in January 2022. And at that time, reportedly Kyivstar was almost certain that the Russians will invade into their border quite soon. But the Kyivstar is not an expert on national security or defense, so they decided to hire security professionals and consulted to provide them with various potential scenarios and listed up prioritizations of actions to take. And because they are a telecommunication service provider, and telecommunication is such a crucial service in peacetime, but also in war times, to support every single services and every single aspect of your daily lives, and also business operations and also military operations. So that is why they decided on how to continue their business operations to keep providing telecommunication services to their customers. So they decided to create extra communication channels, database backups, and also provide satellite phones to their employees just in case. And they also relocated crucial devices and warehouses to the western part of Ukraine, because the western part of Ukraine would be safer compared to the eastern part of Ukraine. So this, and they actually spent a few million US$ before the war started to provide a good resilience of their infrastructure. And this actually worked to keep their resilience, even though that the Russians started to launch missiles on the Kyivstar compounds and facilities. And then, as we have been observing over the last 2 years in Ukraine, now once the war or the conflict occurs, that the war is not just about military versus military fights, because the military services also dependent on systems, services, and technologies provided by the companies, and also to survive. And civilians, and also the sovereignty and land. Now you have to keep economic activities, even though that it's harder, obviously, than in peacetime. But it is a really difficult time for civilians. Of course, it is really difficult time for soldiers. But according to the one news article in English I read, that critical infrastructure company employees started to even forget passwords due to the extreme stress and fear, even after 1 month into the war. And can you imagine that if you cannot remember a good password, then can you also maintain a good security or cybersecurity, because you will easily make mistakes. So that is why then how to maintain good psychological health is also really important for whole of society, resilience, cybersecurity, and security for the country. And of course, once the war happens, war or conflict happens, and your adversary doesn't follow, doesn't pay attention to holidays or weekend, or maybe they will just take advantage of the holidays and weekends to trick you. But it means that the exhaustion will just get accumulated over and over the course of the war or conflict. So this also adds up another stress to cybersecurity defenders. And maybe in the beginning of the war, the Russians were not able to combine the different means to launch attacks by cyber, kinetic, and disinformation or information campaigns, but they were able to combine these methods during the war. And also, it makes more difficult for cyber defenders to send cybersecurity experts to fix or identify the cause compared to the peacetime. And it took actually 1 year for Ukrainians to find out that actually one of the blackout was happened due to a cyber attack from Russians, not due to a missile attack, because it took a longer time for them to find it out for investigation. And last year, according, I think it was from the Microsoft report, and reportedly, the Russians started to attack on Ukrainian agriculture sector in summer 2023 in combination of kinetic attacks, but also cyber attacks and also disinformation campaigns. So now, because not only the cyber defenders are closely watching what's going on and the cyber war between the Russians and the Ukrainians, so we should also apply our defenses to prepare for potential next crisis in this region. And the US government started to alert about the China's potential cyber usage in a Taiwan crisis in February 2023, namely the annual threat assessment by the Director of National Intelligence. Because the US government is concerned that those cyber attacks may be used to deter US military action by impeding US decision-making, inducing societal panic, and interfering with the deployment of US forces. And they also listed potential targets by those cyber disruptions, namely oil and gas pipelines and rail systems. And 5 months later, the New York Times published a really intriguing article, and some of you might have already read it. So according to the New York Times, the Biden administration had been doing threat hunting in the networks of electricity, communications, and water supplies to support US bases in and outside the United States. So we have to think about now which countries have US bases outside the United States, and which country would play a key role to support if anything happened in Asia. And 6 months later, the Washington Post published another intriguing article. Actually, the United States had found out that Chinese cyber attacks had breached the water facility in Hawaii and the major port on the West Coast and oil and gas pipeline in the United States over the last year. So then this also underlines the warning by the DNI and the US government, and also the New York Times article. And then 1 month later, January 2024, actually this year, the US government announced that they had disrupted cyber operations that targeted US communications, energy, transportation, and the water. So again, this underlines the warning, pre-warning from the US government in February 2023. And also we should notice that the US government acknowledged that these cyber attacks had targeted not only the United States, but also other foreign victims, although that the US government didn't specify which countries had been under attacks. So because the US government has been proactively sharing such cyber security indication with the rest of the world, including their like-minded countries and allies. So the Japanese are now also taking this seriously. And again, once the war started in Ukraine, many Japanese people got really shocked because we had never seen this kind of atrocity in different domains in our lifetime. And also we started to seriously think about what if anything happens in East Asia. So that is why the Japanese government decided to update the national security strategy in December 22 to improve our defense posture. And one of the main pillars of the new national security strategy is cybersecurity. And one of them is namely active cyber defense and threat hunting. And I do know that active cyber defense is such a confusing terminology because each person and each organization and each country has different definitions what active cyber defense means. But according to this document, it sounds like the Japanese government meant that the government increases their intelligence capabilities to proactively use intelligence to close the gap of our cyber defenses, but also, if they can, they will try to stop the damages by certain cyber attack if before it happens, if they believe that that kind of cyber attack would create a significant damage to the Japanese national security. And also that the new strategy specifically mentioned to increase the size of the self-defense forces cyber defense command up to 4,000 by Japanese fiscal year 2027. And at that time, the core member of Cyber Defense Command was 890. So almost 4 times bigger to increase their capabilities. And also, Japan has NISC, National Center of Incident Readiness and Strategy for Cybersecurity. So it is equivalent to the US DHS CESA or the Australian ACSC to be responsible for national level of cybersecurity and creating strategy and policies and protection of critical infrastructure. And they will expand the size and responsibility. So next steps. So the Japanese government has been doing a lot for cybersecurity and also the security overall. Why? Because cybersecurity cannot stand on their own. They have to be supported by the broader and bigger security posture. So the Japanese government submitted new legislations draft to the Diet on security clearance under the Economic Security Promotion Act this March. And this new legislation also covers cybersecurity. So this may lead to increased information sharing on cybersecurity between the government and industry. But first of all, they has to be passed in the Diet. And the NISC, the Japanese National Cybersecurity Center, will double the size this April. Why April? Because the April is the beginning of Japanese fiscal year. So these two facts indicate how much caring the Japanese government is to promote cybersecurity. So as the Ukraine has demonstrated even to counter formidable cyber attacks, both cyber espionage and cyber disruptions, long-term cyber defense buildup can work. If you use good cyber security intelligence, cyber threat intelligence, red teaming, threat hunting, and also if you have the broader security enhancement to support your whole of society resilience, then you can do a lot for your cyber defenses. But now to do that, of course, you have to study it on your own. And then, only then, you can start deepening and expanding international collaboration with other governments, with like-minded countries, and also global tech companies. But you have to show that you have capabilities and you are worth their attention and support. And because this webinar is about Japan and Australia, and I really want to express my gratitude to my Australian friends, because now Japan and Australia are quasi allies, and we are doing a lot, especially after the two governments released the joint declaration on security cooperation in 2022, and it covers cybersecurity, of course. And we are doing a cybersecurity collaboration through Quad and FOIP as well. And I really look forward to doing a lot for cybersecurity and also security with Australian friends and also with other friends from different countries. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Miho. We'll move straight on, though, to Greg and get the Australian perspective on the response to Ukraine-Russia, and then we'll come back and exchange views and then open up views. So over to you, please, Greg.
Well, thank you, Glenn. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon from Australia. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be chatting about this, and thank you, Miho, for such an excellent presentation. When I work out in a moment how to page down, I will. There we go. Page up. Ladies and gentlemen, I thought I'd begin just with reference to the way in which some countries have reacted emotionally to what we in the Russia-Ukraine war in terms of cyber operations. And I thought I'd pick out what the French commander of their cyber command had said. And he observed that cyber war has well and truly taken place in Ukraine and by Russia against its allies, against Ukraine's allies, contrary to the view that in the absence of a cyber Pearl Harbor. And I thought this is interesting because it's basically saying to people who spend a lot of time arguing about, well, will we have a cyber Pearl Harbor or won't we? Will cyber war take place or won't it? At the end of the day, what we both in the lead up to February 2022 and definitely since February 2022, we've seen a degree of cyber confrontation and cyber conflict. It's a whole new class of cyber war. There are Russian commentators who say it's the world's first cyber war. And I think that it's really good to just sort of dwell on how is it that the cyber operations in the Russia-Ukraine war and by Russia against Ukraine's allies, how those operations have changed the mindset of key people in governments around the world. And I've just put there a couple of bullet points about the way in which France is responding by increasing spending on some activities, expanding its cyber military force, and indeed leading a diplomatic effort amongst the cyber commands in Europe. Also, to preface my remarks, I'd just like to sort of emphasize that while today I'll be talking mostly about the Australian Signals Directorate, or ASD, which is a civilian intelligence agency, we do need to bear in mind that all of the governments we're looking at have important separate streams of activity one on the civilian and intelligence side, and one on the military operations side. Both streams of activity have been influenced heavily by what we've seen in the Ukraine-Russia war. There is more information available from some governments than others, and the mix of civilian intel on the one hand with military activities on the other varies from country to country. And I won't go into that specifically here, and perhaps in Q&A we can get into it a little bit. But I'm going to be talking largely about the efforts by the Australian government to upgrade its civilian intelligence capability and explain then how that feeds into the military side. So Australia has been one of the most radical countries in terms of what it has announced in response, or should I say at least after the start of the Russia-Ukraine war, or the restart of the Russia-Ukraine war in February 2022. In March 2022, the government announced that a massive and ambitious plan which would effectively see doubling of spending on cyber activities and ASD capabilities that would deliver 3 times the current offensive cyber capability, 2 times the persistent cyber hunt activities, and 4 times the global footprint. Now, those sorts of statements are a little bit, uninformative, unless you know much about the previous levels of Australian offensive cyber capability, cyber hunt, but we shouldn't be too impressed by these figures, tripling of offensive cyber capability and doubling of cyber hunt, because we're a pretty low level in terms of intensity and number of operations according to the public record. What is really interesting about the announcements from the Australian government, commitment to 1,900 new technologists, corporate and enabling roles across Australia to support mostly the Australian Signals Directorate, the intelligence capability, cyber intelligence capability, as well as some federal police functions. Underpinning the reorientation of Australian cyber policy was a commitment to double the annual, was going to be 10 billion Australian dollars over 10 years. That would effectively double the spending. It would see an increase of ASD personnel from around 3,000 to around 4,900, very roughly speaking. The government justified this massive expansion with the following commentary. Not much mention of Russia and Ukraine, a little bit of mention of China, but really avoiding the geopolitical setting. The most important aspect of their public statements in justifying this new project, Red Spice, to radically increase ASD's capability, the first point mentioned was the centrality of cyberspace to warfare. Now, that might sound like it's familiar territory. The Australian government had used that sort of terminology before. Other governments had certainly used that. But the really important thing to note about this new spending package and the way it was represented publicly is it did mark a step up in Australian security thinking about where the world was headed. And this was delivered in large part because of the cyber operations in and around Ukraine and by Russia against Ukraine's allies after February 2022. But the Australian government is also committed, as Miho alluded to with respect to the United States and Japan, the Australian government also sees a need for new approaches, an offensive approach to defending critical infrastructure. The Australian government also talked about new strike capabilities and offensive cyber for the Australian Defence Force in a way they quite hadn't done before. All this is sort of wrapped up in the commitment by the leadership of the Australian Signals Directorate that they plan to change at scale and speed. The announcement of this new program for the Australian Signals Directorate was in March 2022. This was only, was less than a month, in fact, after the Russian commencement of the battle for Kiev and the new phase in the Russia-Ukraine war. So one can easily reach a conclusion that the war might not have been the catalyst for this increase, and that it was probably already being developed prior to the outbreak of the war. I think that's a certainty. The Australian government doesn't move that quickly in 3 weeks to announce massive expansion of its cyber capabilities, I don't believe. But the way in which the government moved so quickly, commitment made in March 2022 into the budget by May 2022, so the budget for the following financial year 2023 to 24, there's an error there, I'm sorry. The speed with which they moved can be attributed in part to the very big change in geopolitics that we saw represented in cyber operations from Russia and Ukraine and their allies in the war. Another explanation, though, for the big Australian change is that the Australian, the Liberal National Party government was facing an election in May of that year, and there's credible information that the decision was made largely for political reasons, but I wouldn't say it was made exclusively for political reasons. There's certainly a big political element to it, but I would say that the Russia-Ukraine war was the main catalyst. And I'm made more confident in that judgment by data that the Australian Signals Directorate have published on major cyber incidents in Australia to which they responded in the previous years. And we can see that the level of activity, serious cyber incidents, and Signals Directorate has responded, the level of activity in the years leading up to this big announcement, there was no sharp increase, and there was really no big effort against the national security apparatus of Australia. Of course, there was some effort, but by and large, there was no spike in hostile cyber activity against key national entities in Australia that might have by itself justified the sort of spike that we were seeing. So if we try and parse out what the justifications for these big changes in Australia were how they were related, I think that we've got on the right here is the best way of looking at it. Russia and China definitely played a part. The previous activities of Russia and China in cyberspace clearly played a part, and Australia had been preparing and elevating, expanding its cyber capabilities, and it's improving its policies in that area. But if you look more deeply at the way in which the Australian government argued for Project Red Spice, a whole lot of things that were happening in cyber policy generally. The Russia-Ukraine war and the cyber operations connected to that were a very big part of this new change. Interestingly, if we look at Australian cyber diplomacy over the 2 or 3 years prior to 2022, we see a shift in Australian cyber diplomacy towards a greater concentration on relationships with the Five Eyes and relatively less attention to the global order type of the cyber norms. But other elements crept into the influence on this big decision in Australia to make this huge cyber. They obviously included cyber lessons from the previous 25 years. Another big stimulator was the high level of geopolitical anxiety that there is in Australia and in the government. From my own personal opinion, the Australian government overestimates Chinese military capability. It overestimates Chinese political influence capabilities inside Australia. But that's all to the good in a sense, because it last produced the sort of uptick in spending for cyber capability that the Australian Armed Forces need to make the leap that some of their key allies have to advanced cyber warfare. And another explanation for the Australian spending, in my view, is recognition that Australia was lagging quite badly behind, especially the UK and the United States, in the way it was integrating cyber capabilities into its armed forces. And just to finish off, the centrality of cyberspace in war and geopolitics was asserted in a 2023 strategic review by the Australian government. They observed that statecraft underpinning national defence posture would involve the reorganisation of elements of national intelligence, substantial investments in cybersecurity, and measures to resist foreign interference and protect critical infrastructure, brackets largely in cyberspace. And one of the important elements of that 2023 strategic review was that cyber capabilities of the ADF would be significantly upgraded. So that, to my mind, is a quick overview of what was involved in this cyber for it. So let me stop there, Glenn, and we can go to the next stage. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Greg, for a very informative and stimulating presentation too. Now let's see whether Miho agrees with that and what she may want to say about your presentation, and then equally you can comment on hers, and we'll open it up to general discussion. Miho, over to you. And you're on mute. Good, you're covered.
Sure. Thank you, Greg, for your wonderful presentation as always. And I'm really, it's really encouraging to see that the Australian government and Australia are paying closer attention to what has been happening in Ukraine, and also to try to doing a lot to enhance your cyber security posture. And also, it's really striking to me that the Australian government already declares to triple your threat hunting capabilities. But I am because threat hunting is totally different from red teaming, because red teaming is sort of easier because if you can get into your systems, then you can say that, okay, so I'm now, my team is now contributing to a better cyber defense posture, because now, and I'm showing to you this gap in our cyber defenses. But threat hunting, you would never know if your adversary is already there or not, in what timing and how. So it will be really difficult to set up KPI, key performance indicators to have a good number of good quality threat hunters. So I'm wondering if the rest of the world can learn from the Australian friends and how we can enhance our threat hunting capabilities, and also to have a good number of threat hunters. And second, so if so you've been really so my second question, the final question is, you've been really modest, and the Australian has been in a catch-up mode to being behind compared to other countries, and especially the United States and the United Kingdom. But what would make you say that, oh, this country is ahead, or this country is behind in terms of cybersecurity? because it's really hard to know. Well, we can tell that well maybe our cyber defenses are not working because we are not affected by cyber espionage, infiltrations, or cyber disruptions. But from the government perspective, it is hard to know if our cyber offense capability is good or not, because you cannot really have the whole the big picture of such an other country's capability, because nobody really wants to reveal their true capabilities. So how can you tell that if you're ahead or behind? Thank you.
Okay, over to you, Greg, for your response to Miho's questions and her presentation, please.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. And thank you, Miho, for your comments and questions. Perhaps if I just quickly take this last question of how do you tell, let me just refer to the studies done by the International Institute of Strategic Studies of 25 countries on their cyber power that we've published, or we had published between June 2021 and 2023. In that sort of analysis, we actually had 3 tiers of cyber power. And the second tier of cyber power, all of those countries who had some good capabilities apart from the United States, which was tier 1. But the tier 2 countries were those which had well-developed, world-class capabilities of cyber power. And the willingness to act across the main activity zones, if you like, of cyberspace operations, everything from intelligence in cyberspace to defensive operations, cyberspace operations, to build a lot and active and to develop your core cyber intelligence capabilities in a way that reinforces important national security objectives. These are the things that make countries stand out in tier 2 compared with tier 3. We only had 3 tiers of cyber power. So in a sense, it's a corrective to the view that, you know, Australia has to catch up. If we compare Australia with, for example, Israel, the United Kingdom, and the United States, we can see many ways in which Australia might need to catch up. But one of the things that was missing in the Australia case when we did those studies was a commitment across government, the mindset to the centrality of cyber power for geopolitics and war was not in place in Australia in the same way it was in place in the United Kingdom and the United States. Then if we can say compare Australia with Japan, one of the big advantages that Australia had was that it was prepared to talk actively and publicly about its cyber capabilities to disrupt Chinese cyber operations. Didn't say much about them, didn't say as much about them as it did about as the US and the UK were saying. But it's that sort of willingness to act, which I think marks out where countries sit on some of these big issues. So we certainly don't need to catch up to Japan. We're ahead of Japan in some of these willingness to act categories, which is why the IISS put Japan in category 3 as opposed to category 2. But let's not dwell too much on that or my opinions of that. Let me commend you, Miho, on your presentation in conveying the degree of shock which the government felt and expressed in different ways through their revision of strategic policy in 2022, the degree of shock that they felt in response to the cyber operations they had seen in the Russia-Ukraine war by Russia against Ukraine's allies, and indeed in the lead-up war in 2022, the lead-up of belligerent cyber activities by Russia and China. And so for Japan, to my mind, this was a bit of a double whammy, given that Russia is a near neighbor of Japan, as well as China being right there with its highly growing military capability. So I thought that just highlighting, in a sense, the way in which Tokyo responded through 2022 with these new policies of active defence, I think that's that really reinforces the message that we were trying to set up for this seminar, is that there's been a sea change in the way countries think about cyber military and strategic capability, and that sea change is very visible in the two, Japan and Australia. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you both for your presentations and your examination of each other's views. Let's move now to open Q&A. And there's three direct questions in Q&A, plus a mix of comments and a few implicit questions in chat. Let's go to those who followed my injunction to use Q&A for their questions. We'll do those first, and then I'll summarise some of the questions that come out of chat if time still permits. Now in QA, you've got three questions from explicit questions from Keith Joyner and one from Dan Svantessen. Let's just take those in turn, if you would. So the speakers can see those questions, but I'll read them out. First of all, from Keith from a while back, 5 years ago, there seemed to still be a real reticence to publicly building offensive cyber or to link it to civilian infrastructure defence. Do you believe the Ukrainian-Russian cyber conflict has reduced this reticence by showing the efficiency of quick offensive cyber counter action? So I think that can be for both speakers. Greg, you're on open mic, so why don't you start as an answer to that first?
Well, thanks, Glenn, and thank you, Keith, for the question. I think it's a really apt observation that you've put down in the Q&A box there to preface your question. The reticence on this score in the Australian case has definitely subsided. The question is whether it's subsided enough to drive the relevant actors to the necessary action. I think there's still a lack of urgency, a lack of depth, and a lack of coherence in the execution of Australian cyber policy when it comes to the national security aspects of critical infrastructure. Let me just stop there. So, quick answer. Thanks.
Miho, do you want to join this one or wait for another question?
Sure. I think the 2-year-long war in Ukraine has reminded us of importance on keeping the balance between having the good offenses and defenses to survive in wartime. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we are more open to talk about offensive cyber capabilities in the public, because now I think that it's because no country wants to reveal their true capabilities, especially the offensive in terms of the cyber offenses. So I think that now the countries are now looking into what kind of defenses and offenses would work in the cyber domain, and also what kind of combinations of cyber kinetic and other methods, including information influence operations, would work, but not necessarily they are open to talk about it. Now we are ready to build our offensive capabilities.
Good, thank you, Miho. A different type of question from Dan. He's wondering whether either of the speakers have any views about Ukraine's so-called IT army. Impactful or not? Lessons for Australia and Japan? So views there from Greg or Miho.
Miho, go first. You go first.
Sure. So I think the IT Army has attracted the most attention from the global audience because of the media coverage. But there are at least multiple other cyber warriors or militia groups, including Ukrainians and also other nationalities. And I think there are many different views of IT Army and cyber militias. A is that it's completely violated the international laws to use civilians to launch offensive operations against, especially against civilian infrastructure facilities. But also, some countries are now observing how to use every single available resource to keep their survival in wartime. And it's really hard to gauge the effectiveness of cyber operations by the Ukrainian IT Army and other cyber militia or warrior groups, because we can only see that their claims on telegrams that here is the evidence that we launched this cyber attack on this critical infrastructure facility or this governmental agency's website or something like that. But it's not really evidence, so we cannot. It's hard for us to prove if it's already happened or it's just a coincidence that the website went down at the same time that they claimed that they actually did a cyber attack.
Okay, if there's nothing more, Greg, from you?
Well, I can't really add much to that. It's not a subject I've followed closely. We have a colleague from Ukraine on the call. If we were able to unmute on Andrew Paziuk, it'd be good if we could maybe come back to his answer on that question a bit later, but I can't really add anything. Thanks.
Andrew's also got a very extended question now, which he's moved across from chat into Q&A. We'll come to that in a moment then and see how we go in unmuting him.
Oh.
Just two more from Keith, then another one from Sid Ontira, and I know there were a couple from Mirad Faisal over in the chat and MK, but first of all, the two from Keith. One is there any public evidence of this conflict, cyber warfare, impacting, this is a Greg type question, impacting Russia's space systems infrastructure? Greg?
Well, from a position of relatively non-existent detailed knowledge, I can say that both Russia and the United States are paying considerable attention to cybersecurity in space. For example, in the United States, they set up an information sharing and analysis center for space 3 or 4 years back. So governments are looking very closely at it. That's all I can say, really. It will be increasingly important. All space-based systems depend on information technology, and to that extent, they're vulnerable unless the owners of those systems pay attention to them. Because of the pace at which, or the times at which space capability were developed relative to the development of advanced cybersecurity for ground-based systems, some people say that perhaps space systems are more vulnerable in cyberspace than many others applications. That's all I can say. Can you add anything on space?
I'm not aware of any cyber incident case that affected the Russian space system over the last 2 years during the war.
Okay, well, we'll move on to another Keith question, which is half comment, half question. How per capita Australia is with the most data breaches of anywhere in the world. Now, it's one metric, but Keith is asking the question, does that suggest Japan may belong above Australia in the tier ranking, or are they less of a target? This, I guess, is probably especially you, Greg, but Miho may want to comment too.
Well, I'd like to turn it towards Miho, if I may, because and frame it in terms of what's the quality of Japanese data, government data on things like data breaches. How good is it? How much effort is Japan putting into the monitoring of these sorts of data breaches? Sorry, Miho.
Oh, sure. So I cannot really compare the Japanese government capabilities to monitor potential data breaches compared to other government capabilities. Again, other government capabilities to monitor potential cases. However, I think at least in the public reporting, including the one kindly shared by Mr. Joyner and also other vendor reports. I think that Japan has been doing a better cyber defenses compared to other countries, including the breaches and also ransomware attacks. And in fact, Japan is the only country that sees the declining ratios to pay ransoms to attacker compared to other developed countries. So I understand that some think tank report, including that was report, look at not only defense capabilities but also offensive capabilities, and there's no public report about how well Japan can do offensive capabilities. But according to the statistics available in the public space, I would say that Japan, those reports indicate that Japan has at least decent cyber defenses.
Thanks, Miho. Now we've got Andrew Patsiuk from Ukraine, and let's just see if his mic can work. And he can ask. Sounds like we can hear you. And go ahead, ask your question and make any comments too.
Okay, thank you so much. Such an interesting, insightful presentations and a very important topic. My question is based on the experience of Ukraine in this war. I'm based in Kiev, and what we are facing now, that we have issues with the control over infrastructure owned previously by Russians. And we have experienced this attack on Kyivstar in December last year. But before that, this company was owned by Russian oligarchs, very closely linked to leadership of Russia. And that's my question regarding possible lessons for Australia and Japan regarding how you see strategical dependencies on other countries, and for example, like Russia and China, and how it can influence your national security, of course, in time of peace, but in time of war, it can hurt whole infrastructure of the country. And that's a question, how to manage this ownership issue and control over critical infrastructure, especially from national security and cybersecurity perspectives. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Greg's got his mic off, so Greg first and then Miho.
Yes, thanks, Andre, for your question. I think it's fair to say that Australian policy on the way in which ICT power is distributed throughout the world in terms of strategic dependencies, I think it's fair to say that Australian policy on that subject is only weakly developed. There is one part of it which is strongly developed, and that's the anxiety element about we don't want too many of these strategic assets being controlled by the Chinese. We led the world in 2012 by blocking Huawei from an important infrastructure development and I appreciate the example you're giving of Kyivstar, which I was not familiar with, but I think interestingly, at a strategic level, the unfolding of the US and Western sanctions on Russia and the withdrawal from Russia of leading ICT corporations and the negative impact that these sorts of sanctions and withdrawals have had on Russian economic capability are positive lessons for Australia in understanding the strategic implications of ICT dominance. And it's positive for Australia because the United States and its allies absolutely dominate global ICT economy. And even though China's been able to penetrate that in the last 10 to 20 years in certain ways, the United States and its allies still occupy something like 45 out of 50 spots for ICT and communications companies in the global Fortune 500 figure. So it's a very complex subject. Australia certainly doesn't have a well-developed view. Its government officials rarely comment on strategic dominance of critical technology sectors beyond illustrating anxiety and fear about China's control. Most Australian government ministers exhibit almost no knowledge of the general distribution of ICT power in the world beyond their fear of China. Thanks.
Miho, you want to comment on this one?
Sure. The Professor Pazyuk made raised legitimate concerns about national security aspects of critical infrastructure. So that is why the Japanese government created the Economic Security Promotion Act a couple of years ago. And it also includes the protection of critical infrastructure facilities. And the new legislations entails to how to mitigate like a foreign influence to or potential disruptions to the stable operations of critical infrastructure, including different means such as cyber attacks, and also that it requires critical infrastructure companies to submit their planning on their cyber defenses. So that's how the Japanese government and the critical infrastructure companies are doing. But I have one question to Professor Pazyuk, if I may, because I understand that the Kyivstar is a part of a Dutch telecom company, VEON. And I didn't know that actually Kyivstar was owned by a Russian businessman until September 2023. So does it mean that only after September 2023, Kyivstar was acquired by the Dutch VEON?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So you know that it's a Dutch company controlled by Russian. So that's the reason why we know about it, that because we checked and transparency in this issue is very important. So because in order to avoid sanctions, Russian using different intermediaries across the world, but it's important to understand who is a direct beneficiary, and so in this way it's important to keep intelligence services for doing such kind of research and checking all connections. So this is important in this supply chain in all areas, but especially in control over such a critical and major telecom company in the country, so that we faced.
So financial management is important as IT and engineering in cybersecurity. Good point. Next question, and there's two of them really from Siddhant Hira. One is about a very general and open question about what are the key requirements for training, skill, and R&D developments of cyber. And I added a finance and economics perspective to Andrew's answer for what that might include. But also, Siddhant was asking about the difference between attributing state and non-state threat actors in cyber operations. How does attribution differ when it's a state versus a non-state actor, and which countries are the most accurate in attributing threat actors? So any of those rich choices you want to come back into, either Greg or Miho or Siddhant, either the general development of skills or the attribution of where threats originate.
Well, perhaps Siddhant can come back after Miho and I have had a bit of a chance at the question. I'm not desperately specialized in attribution. It's worth noting that Russia and China have not engaged in attribution of cyber attacks against them in the detail that the US and its allies have engaged in attribution of cyber attacks by them on the US and its allies. I would naturally put a high degree of confidence in many of the things that the US and its allies publish, but I do feel that the choices about what these countries attribute and the way in which they do it is highly political and doesn't give the public a very good, a very consistent picture of the threats and how they're unfolding. I certainly am not in a position to comment on which countries do it the most accurately. Maybe Siddhant or Miho might have a point of view on that. Thanks.
Miho, view?
So to piggyback on what Justin Greg said, so there's no 100% intelligence or 100% accurate intelligence analysis. So whenever a country or the organizations provides public attributions of a cyber attack to specific hacker group or country, they would also put a little caveat on how confident they are about the attribution, like a moderate or like highly confident. So whenever we see that kind of public attribution, we should also pay attention to what kind of confidence they have in their public attribution, because there will be no 100%.
Okay, now we're starting to run out of time. We do have a few more questions. We had a lot of comments and questions from MK, and out of the richness of what MK was saying, let me pick one very specific question for asking both of you, though, which is at one point, MK, who's got a rather cynical view of the nature of democracy and how it operates, and the colonial mentality of some governments, including ones we've been talking about today. But there was a question of how much cyber becomes useful as an electoral tool for rhetorical purposes, divert electorates from other more telling issues at election time. So how much is it actually a rhetorical or electoral tool that is used by governments such as Japan and Australia? Can I use that version of some of MK's comments to ask you guys a question about the electoral use and misuse of cybersecurity, particularly at election time? Would you care to comment on that if you wish?
Miho, do you want to go first?
So because the year of 2024 is election year, we just had Taiwanese elections, and the US presidential campaign is going on. So then we are certainly really, we as cyber defenders and paying close attention to what's happening, and also potential disruptions and influence campaigns against those political campaigns. And of course, there are two worst case scenarios. So one is like what happened in 2016. Using cyber breaches and steal information from powerful candidates and release it to trick their and lower the political influence or the winning chances of that political candidate. And another one is to use influence operations to divide political public opinions about that political election campaigns, and also to try to lower the public's confidence in their democracy. So, and also because now the generative AI and artificial intelligence can create really convincing messages and even videos and images really quickly and with less effort. So that is why we as cyber defenders and also take advantage of emerging technologies, including AIs, to maximize our efforts to tackle with potential operations against our democracy.
Well, if I could just add a footnote, really, I think it's fair to say that the Australian government, Australian political actors, Australian thinkers, Australian political activists are very alert to the dangers and the benefits of cyberspace for political activity. But I would venture to say that it's far less developed than it is in the United States. I think we need to study more closely overseas experience in how this is being handled and move rapidly to implement what we can that's appropriate, both on the defensive side, the offensive side, while recognizing the importance of respecting the privacy and independence of individual voters. It's a very complex matter. I think that it needs more attention from the Australian government. Our default position for the moment is let's stop the Chinese from interfering in our political way of life. I don't think there's as much attention as we need being paid to the diverse ways in which ICT impinge on the privacy and the rights of Australian citizens. Thanks.
Okay, now we're just about out of time. I want to ask a question from Elizabeth Baptista and to rescue one that I saw earlier in chat from Mohammed Faisal. From Elizabeth, a more constructive thought. How do Australia and Japan assist neighbouring developing countries in the cybersecurity domain?
Well, let me go first. I have a quick thought on this. There's been a shift in the way in which both Japan and Australia, but let me talk about Australia. There's been a shift in the way Australia has viewed its international contributions after the Russia-Ukraine war broke out, as it did in February 2022. The Australian government has learned that mutual assistance is far more beneficial than the old traditional approach of capacity building. Problem solving when a country is attacked is far more important capability to develop than broad ideas about cybersecurity capacity broadly conceived. Thanks.
Okay, can we move on? There's one popped up from Peter Vanderhoost, and since it's come all the way from the Netherlands, let me ask it and get an answer. What's the biggest single challenge for Japan to implement active cyber defense and become a tier A cyber power? And where do you see the biggest progress made recently, e.g. finding and training personnel, changing legislation, willingness to share information between stakeholders, anything else? So priorities, Miho, what do you think the priorities should be to even accelerate the Japanese ratings and rankings even higher than they are at present?
So, honestly, we are still waiting to see the exact definition what active cyber defense in the Japanese setting, because the national security strategies only gives the vague definition of active cyber defense. However, I would say that whatever definition the Japanese government will come up with to give it to the self-defense forces under the newer versions of NISC. And it will fundamentally comes down to people, and both offensive and defensive capabilities. And because just like any other countries, it will be it is very challenging for the government and the militaries to maintain and hire the good cyber security people. So now also the time for the Japanese government, what kind of good cybersecurity carrier they can provide for the people in the self-defense forces.
Okay, well, you can't answer on behalf of Japan, Greg, so we'll switch now to Mohammed Faisal. And this is a question that I think was Elizabeth Baptista opened up a little earlier, but let's finish with this one. And it's from the chat rather than the Q&A. In the scenario of conflict in the East and Southeast Asia, what are the prospects and possible scope of cyber warfare cooperation between Japan and Australia under the Quad? And then B, the possible cyber warfare support that Japan and Australia would provide to like-minded ASEAN countries affected by the conflict. Well, I think you've answered the second, but what about the first, which is the prospects and possible scope of cyber warfare cooperation between Japan and Australia under the Quad? So over to both our speakers, and then we'll be finishing up.
Well, let me go first, perhaps very quickly. The prospect of enhanced Australia-Japan cooperation in international security is very good in general terms. It will take some time to develop appropriate mechanisms and appropriate areas for collaboration. It won't happen necessarily in the framework of the Quad because India would not necessarily support that sort of direct bilateral activity to be represented as an activity of the Quad. But I think over the next 5 to 10 years, we'll see operational cooperation between the Japanese armed forces and the Australian armed forces in cyberspace issues, even if it's not desperately deep. Thank you.
Okay, Miho, last word to you.
Sure. So my understanding is that Quad doesn't necessarily just focusing on defense. Quad covers cybersecurity, but because it can be really sensitive. So that is why they are avoiding the use of term security or defense necessarily. So if you are talking about cybersecurity collaboration in a crisis to support the Southeast Asian countries, I think that it will be like a more like how the Quad countries can provide a good cyber threat intelligence to help the industries or trades to avoid disruption by potential cyber attacks, but not necessarily for their Southeast Asian defenses or national security.
Okay, thank you. And that's just about right on time, or indeed a tiny bit over. So let me close the webinar by thanking our speakers and all the participants today, including those who sent in their questions and comments. And one small final advertisement, if you're interested, do check out the Social Cyber Institute website for our newly announced SCI Fellows Program, which is a global program, and also our call for papers for the Social Cyber Institute publication. We'd love to hear from any of you who are interested in those. And thank you all, and keep in touch. We appreciate the speakers' efforts today. Lisa Maturano's back up for us, and let's hope we talk together and communicate constructively and openly on these matters again in the future. Thank you all.